the following remarks on our national capacity. At the outset, we recognize the presence of and extend our warmest welcome to His Excellency Mr. Bruno Rodriguez Parilla, Minister of Foreign Affairs of the Republic of Cuba. We are also grateful to the Secretary General of the United Nations for presenting his report on this important issue. Mr. President, we are guided by the rules of international law. We are guided by the purposes and principles of the UN Charter. In particular, developing friendly relations among states, achieving international cooperation, and respecting the principle of sovereign equality of states, non-interference in the internal affairs of states, and freedom of international trade and navigation. It's why Algeria reaffirms its unwavering commitment to advocating for the lifting of the unjust embargo against Cuba, which has lasted for over 6 decades. Our debate today regarding this resolution entitled Necessity of Ending the Economic, Commercial, and Financial Embargo imposed by the United States of America against Cuba for the 32nd consecutive year demonstrate once again that the international community's steadfast support for the Cuban government and people. It also reaffirms the urgent need to lift the blockade unjustly imposed on Cuba. This year, the Secretary General's report has again highlighted the terrible impact of this embargo on Cuba. In this regard, Algeria continues to express deep concern and disappointment at the severe and inhumane treatment of the Cuban people. The ongoing economic, commercial, and financial blockade continues to have disastrous consequences for the growth, the economic growth, and the socio-economic development of Cuba and its effort to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals by 2030. Mr. President, Algeria firmly stands in resolute solidarity with Cuba and its people and rejects the imposition of unilateral laws and decisions. We also oppose unilateral coercive measures not authorized by the relevant United Nations organs, which violate human rights and hinder the well-being and prosperity of peoples. In the same vein, we demand the exclusion of Cuba from the unilateral list of alleged state sponsors of terrorism. In conclusion, Mr. President, Algeria reaffirms once again its steadfast support for the Cuban people and their cause against the blockade. Just as we have done in previous year, my delegation will vote in favor of the resolution. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished permanent representative of Algeria for his statement, and I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Belarus.
Mr. President, the Republic of Belarus joins the statement delivered on behalf of the non-aligned movement and the statement delivered on behalf of the group of friends in defense of the Charter of the United Nations. We welcome the participation of the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Cuba, Bruno Rodriguez Parilla. The Republic of Belarus categorically objects to unilateral restrictive measures against a member state of the United Nations. The imposition of unilateral sanctions represents an egregious violation of the Charter of the United Nations and of international law, which jeopardizes the system of international relations through the increasing of potential for conflict and hostility in international relations. The ongoing economic, commercial, and financial embargo against Cuba imposed by the United States of America in violation of the principles of international law on the non-intervention in domestic affairs of states, the obligation of states to cooperate with one another, equality, self-determination of peoples, sovereign equality of states, as well as respect for human rights and fundamental freedoms, has over decades constrained the development of the independent country, preventing Cuba from enjoying fair opportunities for the advancement of progress, prosperity, and sustainable development on equal footing with other states in the world. We once again stress that the main victim of unilateral sanctions measures is the Cuban people. The illegal restrictions in the area of trade, currency, banking sector, and tourism is a flagrant violation of human rights, doing damage to millions of Cuban citizens, resulting in economic uncertainty, unemployment, and absence of opportunities. The economic blockade against Cuba is the most protracted, inhumane act of economic warfare ever perpetrated against an independent state. This goes far beyond bilateral relations. Not only does it affect the Cuban people, but it also affects trade between Cuba and third countries. The unabated attempts to isolate Cuba in breach of international law and resolutions adopted by the overwhelming majority of UN member states annually is an example of the blatant disregard for the principle of multilateralism and disregard for the political will of the international community. We view the extraterritorial consequences of the blockade and the inclusion of Cuba in the list of state sponsors of terrorism by the United States unilaterally as nothing other than an inhumane act of aggression against a sovereign state. We believe fully that in an era of profound transformation to establish multilateralism and the greater international cooperation, which is the basis for sustainable development on the global level, that there can be no place for unilateral sanctions measures here. Belarus and Cuba are friendly states. We continue to cooperate, which reflects the interest of the peoples of both countries advancing economic and social development. We call for the full and conditional lifting of the economic, financial, and commercial blockade against Cuba by the United States, and to resume for the U.S. to resume dialogue to rekindle the process that had once begun to normalize relations with Havana for the benefit of the peoples of both states. We will continue to vote in support of the resolution until the blockade is lifted. Thank you for your attention.
I thank the distinguished representative of Belarus for his statement. I now give the floor to the distinguished permanent representative of Trinidad and Tobago.
Mr. President, at the outset, Trinidad and Tobago aligns itself with the statements made by the representatives of the Group of 77 and China, the Non-Aligned Movement, the Community of Latin American and Caribbean States, and the Caribbean Community. We welcome the esteemed presence of His Excellency Bruno Rodriguez Parilla, the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Cuba. Mr. President, consistent with the Charter of the United Nations and with international law, Trinidad and Tobago subscribes fully to the fundamental principles of sovereign equality of states and non-intervention in their internal affairs. By any measure, therefore, discriminatory international trade practices and the extraterritorial application of domestic laws constitute a stark contradiction to these very principles and an affront to international law. It is therefore our obligation as a small island developing state in the Caribbean, a responsible member state of the United Nations, and a resolute advocate for the rule of law, to reiterate yet again our objection to the application of unilateral coercive economic measures as a means of political and economic coercion against other states. Such practices undermine global solidarity, threaten multilateralism, and frustrate sustainable development. Since 1972, Trinidad and Tobago has enjoyed a strong tradition of warm, cordial, and mutually productive relations with the Republic of Cuba. And we value this relationship just as we do with any other state in our hemisphere and elsewhere. We therefore stand in full solidarity with the government and people of Cuba, who for more than 6 decades have been the object of an unjust embargo, inflicting much pain and suffering on the Cuban people. For more than 6 decades, that interventionist policy strategy has hindered and continues to hinder the full enjoyment of human rights by the Cuban people, including most especially the right to development, and severely undermines their prospects for attaining economic stability and growth. The economic, commercial, and financial embargo unjustly and unlawfully imposed upon Cuba as a sovereign state must therefore be brought to a halt, and all measures must be implemented to ensure that country's full reintegration into the international economic and political system. In this context, we have consistently supported and will continue to support regional and international efforts to promote a good faith, constructive dialogue between the parties with the objective of the cessation of the economic, commercial, and financial embargo. We therefore urge the parties concerned to work to build a mature and open bilateral relationship based on mutual respect and sovereign equality. Additionally, we remain unconvinced of the designation of Cuba as a state sponsor of terrorism and call for the removal of this baseless categorization that is responsible for the imposition of incalculable costs and negative consequences for the Cuban people and economy. Mr. President, Trinidad and Tobago looks forward to the day when the Cuban people will be allowed to live without externally driven, politically determined shortages of food, medicines, fuel, transport, as well as other basic services, and there will be no need for this General Assembly to adopt a resolution condemning the unlawful embargo against Cuba. However, until then, Mr. President, Trinidad and Tobago does not countenance that there will be any variation to its unwavering support for the resolution on the necessity of ending the economic, commercial, and financial embargo by the United States of America against Cuba. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished permanent representative of Trinidad and Tobago for his statement. I now give the floor to the distinguished permanent representative of St. Lucia.
Thank you, Mr. President. St. Lucia aligns itself with the statements delivered on behalf of CARICOM, on behalf of CELAC, on behalf of NAM, on behalf of the G77 and China. St. Lucia warmly welcomes the presence of the Foreign Minister of Cuba and his delegation. Mr. President, St. Lucia reaffirms its sacred commitment to the purposes and principles of the Charter of the United Nations. The principles of the sovereign equality of states, non-intervention and non-interference in the internal affairs of states, as well as the peaceful coexistence among nations, remain the tenets of this institution. Mr. President, in essence, we, the peoples of the United Nations, committed to live as good neighbors. St. Lucia joins with the great majority of the membership of the United Nations and reiterates its support for the resolution which continues to call for the end to the economic, commercial, and financial embargo imposed by the United States of America against Cuba. The application of unilateral measures applied in an extraterritorial manner are counter to the spirit of the United Nations Charter. Such measures are adverse to the right to development, as recognized by the General Assembly in numerous resolutions, and the deleterious effects and impact of unilateral coercive measures on the enjoyment of human rights on the society, particularly the day-to-day lives of the people of Cuba, cannot be overstated. This long-standing 62-year-old unlawful economic, commercial, and financial embargo imposed by the United States against Cuba has been out of step with the principles for far too long. St. Lucia's continued apprehension over the continuation of the embargo against our fellow Caribbean state was most recently echoed by the heads of government of the Caribbean community when they expressed grave concern about the deteriorating humanitarian situation resulting from the embargo wrongfully imposed on the people of Cuba. The impact of the embargo is wide-ranging. It affects and restricts access to foreign currency, inputs, raw materials, fuels, machinery, fertilizers, chemical products, technologies, and the imposition of penalties on shipping companies that would otherwise service Cuba. The consequences are real and far-reaching, including the reduction in food production. The recent collapse of Cuba's national grid highlights the impact of these limitations that these limitations place on the effective functioning of the country. Mr. President, Cuba is also no less impacted by climate change. As a fellow small island developing state, St. Lucia is well aware of the ongoing impact of storms and hurricanes. We can only imagine the compounded complexities of the recent passage of Hurricane Oscar on the lives of the people of Cuba. CARICOM heads of government have agreed to provide material support to assist Cuba in the recovery phase, just as Cuba has assisted us in the past in health sector, the education sector, and so much more. It is our humanitarian duty to respond when one of our Caribbean family requires it. Mr. President, St. Lucia echoes CARICOM in considering the U.S. State Department's ongoing inclusion of Cuba on its list of state sponsors of terrorism as wrong and offensive. We join the call for Cuba to be removed from the list of countries deemed to be state sponsors of terrorism. Mr. President, leaving no one behind is what gives meaning to our 2030 agenda for sustainable development. The unselfish assistance of Cuba through cooperation and direct support to the Caribbean and the wider world is its demonstration of its own commitment to advancing our agenda for development. Cuba has been a good neighbor. We, in turn, must embrace Cuba and truly leave no one behind. St. Lucia expresses the hope that the present resolution on this question is respected and the will of the overwhelming majority of the nations of the world. The indomitable spirit of the Cuban people remains an inspiration, and we reaffirm our sincere call to end this embargo. St. Lucia joins in expressing our full solidarity with the government and people of Cuba. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished permanent representative of St. Lucia for her statement. And I'll give the floor to the distinguished representative of Malaysia.
We'll be right back in a moment with more statements as the UN plenary session debates on the necessity to remove Cuba from the list of sponsoring terrorism and to end the U.S. blockade that has been imposed against the Caribbean island for more than 60 years.